Savagery Part 1. The bold winds had been stilled for centuries by the time Savagery was born. It was a dead, silent world he came into, a world destroyed by its very guardians, by the species that had been dominant on it and should have protected it. He came at the very end of civilization, when human progress had halted to make way for the struggle to survive. He was born into a hot, barren world. The mighty rivers of a country ago, the mighty rivers of a century ago had long since dried up, leaving dusty beds that covered anyone daring to cross them with grime. Dust clouds rose in the air with nothing to check them. No moisture, nothing. No significant rain had been seen in 80 years. What little water Savagery's people had came from an ancient well in a corner of the village. This had to supply the entire village at the foothills of towering, dusty, rocky mountains. So there was never quite enough to go around. There was no farm, nothing was cultivated. Food was scavenged from the ruins of the ancient city nearby, which for a little village of about 200 people did very well. For the moment when the ancient stores ran in one part of the city, the people scavenged in another part. It had been a huge city once. It did for the people. They had no thought of what would happen when everything ran out. When the wells stopped giving water, or when the old buildings had been emptied of the tins of food they contained. They lived in the present. There was no cultivation, no fields of vegetables except some beans growing wild, which the people sometimes cooked over a fire and ate. They hadn't lost the use of fire, not yet. Savagery was born in a sickly baby. Savagery was born a sickly baby, as most babies were at that time. In the beginning, he would cry and cry, trying to communicate something no one could understand. Red and wrinkled and unhappy, he seemed to hate the dirty, dusty walls of the hovel. He lived in his mother's hovel, and he grew older. It got better. He seemed to get used to it, and his scrawny limbs fleshed out a bit when he started running around with the scavenging children. They ran all over the city. At least they thought it was the whole city. They had no idea how big it was, and no one wondered what had happened to all the people who must have lived in it, because the city must have been made for a lot more than 200 people. They took it for granted that this was where they lived. These were the times they had. Today was the only important thing, and they were not even aware that they thought this way. There was no discipline in the settlement. There was a chief, but he had become so sobby by the dint of his dominator personality and not dishonest qualification In times such as these, he had little control over his people, parents had little control over their children, society had no control over the villages.